So today we're going to cover procurement, we're going to cover oversight and monitoring, we're going to talk about WIOA financial governance, sort of the agreements and all the various agreements that need to be in place, as well as internal controls. So again, anytime you got questions, let's raise your hand, we'll try to address those. Okay, so procurement, let's just talk real quick. Things have changed a lot in procurement a bit with the uniform guidance and sort of ETA's interpretation. It's changed a bit, but we're going to talk about the regulations and standards. We're going to talk about the process, methods, procedures, and thresholds that apply when you're buying things. Talk about when you get into the nitty-gritty, evaluation, negotiation, protest, appeals, responsibilities by both parties, as well as some specific WIOA procurement requirements like the one-stop operator review services, things like that, right? When we talk procurement in the uniform guidance, that's talking buying commercial items, buying tables, pencils, books. It's not necessarily talking about our grant proposals. There's a part in there that says competitive proposals, and that sort of covers it, but we're really talking about buying things. That's why we have these thresholds, okay? They can be adopted for grants. It depends what your policies are and so forth, but we're really talking about commercial buys. Uniform guidance says that doesn't apply to grants, so you have a different process for selecting your grant if you choose to. Again, we talked about this yesterday. Procurement's now grouped in 3 areas. We have informal, which is the micro purchase and small purchase. We have formal, which is sealed bids and proposals, which are rating. And then we have non-competitive, which is sole source. Thresholds have been increased due to the uniform guidance changes. Micro purchase is increased to 10,000 and up to 50,000. You have to self-certify yourself as a low-risk auditee. You have comprehensive procurement policies and procedures. And then anything over 50,000, you would require approval from the cognizant agency. But right now, so up to 10,000 is the micro purchase, right? Small purchase has been increased to 250,000, which is called the simplified acquisition, right? And then we have closeout is extended 90 to 120, submitting final reports. We've talked about that. So I don't want to jump ahead. Again, we've changed terms. We got rid of non-federal entity. We talk about recipients and sub-recipients unless it's stated in the announcement or so forth, or the federal entity uses another term, but it's basically recipient and sub-recipient, right? These are some. I'm going through some of the updates that happened before just real quick. We've added different characteristics determining what's a sub-recipient, what's a contractor. This is very important because if you're a contractor and you're a vendor, we used to call it vendor, now it's contractor, these rules do not apply to you per se, like, single audit, all those kind of things. I mean, you still go through a procurement process to select them, but they don't have to follow the rules of, cost allowability and all those things. Sub-recipients have to follow our rules. And we've designated certain recipients as sub-recipients, entities, like the one-stop operator. We say that's a sub-recipient operation because we're providing programmatic services. We've increased OMB to $1 million. Audits are procured. Generally, that's a procurement process, so we don't select those, you procure those. Thresholds for supplies and equipment have gone from 5,000 to 10,000. Prior approval is needed if you exceed those, and it's prior written approval. FPOs cannot approve that. It must be the grant officer. Also, at closeout, what do you do with the equipment or supplies? We look at that value. If it's over that value, you pay the money back to DOL. If it's under that value, you just keep it and use it, right? We've removed the simplified acquisition threshold for fixed award amounts, so that means they can be larger awards. It used to be they were capped and you have to get approval. It used to be at 250, now it's been removed. And you can establish your own thresholds below or whatever with prior approval from the federal agency. So some of the bigger organizations like educational will come to DOL or they're cognizant and say, we need a bigger threshold for these. We can justify it. We have procedures in place and so forth and controls, and we usually approve that. In the uniform guidance, they mentioned if you have stuff in your proposal, it's considered approved. That's not true. DOL considers if stuff needs prior approval, you still have to come in to the DOL. So equipment over 10,000 on a direct grant, you still have to ask for prior approval, no, even if you've listed it, so forth, things like that. We say, provide us a list within 90 days and so we can go through it and approve it right away. There is a rule that says, DOL says, we will not approve any equipment in the last year of a grant. You've said you needed it, buy it right away. Don't wait to the end. We know it takes time to buy things. Sometimes if they're large amounts, you got to go through a process, but do it right away. And you can start the process before you receive the grant award. You know, I mean, if you've been named but you haven't received the document, you can go through a process and saying, we've already done a procurement. This is what we want to buy. We've done all that, so that you could probably buy it day one. Okay. So let's talk about the requirements now for procurement. Uniform guidance is this section 317 to 326 that deals with procurement. The Workforce Innovation Act talks about, Opportunity Act talks about procurement in these sections. We've issued guidance on competitive selection of the one-stop operator. We've also have frequently asked questions are out there too. And that's another thing, you know, the Uniform Guidance has a big section on frequently asked questions. So if you're not sure about something, you can go to that and see if your question's been asked. And they'll have OMB will have a response to that. So we try to update these as things change and so forth. UG applies to all grants and cooperative agreements, right? Applies to all subrecipients who receive a grant, an agreement, or a subaward or another subrecipient. So that's why you say terminology. You're a recipient, a subrecipient, those are subawards. They're not subcontracts or contracts. It's two different things. States, and the Uniform Guidance says states follow their policy. Whatever their procurement policy is, they follow that. We don't interfere with the states. We just say you follow it when using. You do the same with non-federal funds and federal funds. You have to use the same policy. There's information about procurement of recovered materials. I don't know how much that applies to us. And also, you got to be sure that you include contract provisions that are required, or grant provisions that are required in these. The guidance would be contract, grants, you have different provisions. Those are in the back of the Uniform Guidance. So you go in the appendix, they'll say for all contracts, these provisions must be in there. And those are like wage and hour, Fair Labor Standards Act, things like that. The grants have certain ones on the other side. So those have to be in every agreement. Non-state entities, so that's everybody else. Applies to subrecipients, direct grants, subs, contractors, certain contractors, depending on if you're doing our work, you know, develop their own document procedures reflecting their laws and regulations and conform to OMB. So that requires all of you as a subrecipient or recipient to have procurement procedures. And in your book, we have that list, comparison of there's required procedures and then just general procedures. We did some cross-referencing. Required procedures, so you need required procedures in all those categories, right? We have the OMB reference as well as the DOL reference, and then the state has references in there, right? The next page, sure. Here's a mic here.
Just on that question about develop and use own documented procurement procedures, as far as the local boards, are they supposed to also reflect or develop a policy? Because there may be variations between the state procurement and the city or the county procurement. So as it stands right now, they need to develop those policies,
Yes,
correct?
yes. Boards have to have it. Usually they work with their fiscal agent to help develop those, but they have to have policies. Boards have to have, and every recipient has to have policies. So they have to conform to OMB, you know, but like the state can always still pass down things to a local board because they're funding you. So they can say you have to follow these, but you also have to have policies just when you're not using our funds, but they have to be consistent. Right?
What if they say, there's a city procurement policy, why do I have to develop our own board policy?
Well, the board's not part of the city. The board.
No, I'm talking about the local board.
The local board, yeah. The local board, they have to have policies. Even if the city has a policy, if they're doing business with the city is what, the grant recipient?
Right.
Okay, and then you have the local board, so you would use the city's procurement policy.
Okay.
You'd have to follow that.
So underscore that they need to develop their own procurement policies.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Right.
No, he said the local boards need to develop their own procurement policy.
Yeah. The board is not a city entity.
But
No, not necessarily. No, not necessarily. Well, it could be here, but sometimes we have 501c3 boards, separate boards, so they'd have those. So that if you're part of the
So
city,
can I jump in a minute? Because I know who she's talking about. The city has this general
or the
policy.
county, because there's.
Or the
other-
county has their
right.
own general policy. They can supplement it with the requirements for whichever grants they have to follow, rather than create a new policy.
Right.
So if you're the agency in the city who is running this and some other type programs, such as grant funds, you can use the city's policy to the extent that it is in compliance with the federal requirements. And where it's not, you note those exceptions
Right.
and stick it in the manual with the rest of it, and that's your manual.
So it should note, though, that.
Absolutely.
That the board should say.
At a minimum.
We are adopting the.
Yes, absolutely.
The
So
county
you-
policy as
that's
our
right.
own.
And
Right.
then they should look to make sure.
and may have, you could add on things to that may not be part of the city policy that are different because of our grants. You know, we have different variations in our grant that may have different things you can say, for these type, we also do this and do that. Because sometimes the city is not going to cover every possibility. They're
Right.
going to be very general. You know, they might just have a threshold and whatnot, but so you can have add-on, but you would adopt the city policy and have maybe additional policies to reflect it also.
Okay,
Right.
thanks.
State board follows the state policy. They're under the state.
It needs to be tweaked for whatever the statutory or regulatory requirements are. Yes. So you can use the state administrative manual, but if it's something in the manual that flies in the face of the, or you need additional, you have to make those changes and keep them with the agency to supplement that other, yes. You could stay online, you could put, the site, where it is found too. But they should be able to look at it and see if it's in compliance with whichever grant funds, because you get other grant funds.
Recipients and subs also awarded under WIOA, Wagner Pizer must follow the uniform guidance and the exception. So it applies to Wagner Pizer, right? Commercial organizations, if they're considered subrecipients, so you can have not for-profit entities doing our work, but they're doing subrecipient work, they have to comply with those requirements, okay? If not, if they're doing other things, the cost principles for them are 48 CFR 31. So they just have a different set of cost principles. Very similar to ours, but just a little different. Because we allow it to pay profit to commercial organizations, right? Big thing here is when you're dealing with, what is it? What is the entity? Are they a recipient or a contractor? Contractors, similar goods, open marketplace, provide goods in the normal business hours. All organizations are not subject to their compliance requirements. They're open for business. It's a public thing. You know what the price is. It's very standardized things, right? And it's funded by a contract. Subs run our program. So they make decisions about our program, eligibility, performance. They're responsible for that. They're responsible for reporting, meeting performance. They're subrecipients to carry out the program. And we use subawards to fund those. So he said, award provided by a pass-through entity to a subrecipient carrying out the program. They receive the award, they pass it through, all those rules apply down. Contracts do not include subawards, they're subcontracts. It's a legal document, legal instrument, purchase property, services to carry out a program of any using their own for their consumption. They receive a contract. We got rid of the term vendor, so now we use contractor, right? Question in the bill. You must have documented procedures that are consistent with the state, the local, and tribal organization regulations of this section for procuring things. You document it, must conform, your procedures must conform to these sections, right? Big thing here, we'll talk about a little later, you must have written standards for conflicts of interest governing the action of employees engaged in the selection, award, and administration of contracts and subawards, right? That's real big. You're going to hear more about that later in internal control and also in the section about financial governance. This is really big now. Everybody's looking at conflict of interests, improper dealings, related parties, things like that. You know, we promote the use of intergovernmental agreements, so you're dealing with other governmental entities at your level. That's fine. You do business with them on a cost reimbursement basis. You make sure that you're awarding funds to entities that can deliver the service or provide the product. They're capable of doing it. Mandatory disclosure of any violations. We talked about that yesterday a little bit. You want to have a process to settle claims, protests, and appeals. Those should all be part of your procedures. Because if you have a protest, you can't do business till that protest is dealt with, so forth. So this is a big part to include these in your procedures. And you try to take all the steps you can to deal with small minority, women, labor, surplus area businesses, and so forth, right? We said that. Placing qualified businesses, solicitation lists, using whenever possible other sources. You can divide your requirements into smaller groups so you can share the business to individuals or organizations. Make sure you have delivery schedules, things are coming on time when you need them, using small business services, things like that, right? So, we talked about this yesterday. You can't contract with the enemy. Anything over 50,000, you'd have to come to DOL. I guess you could contract if it's under 50,000. I don't understand it, but it seems like it'd be just a blanket. You can't contract with the enemy, and we don't want you splitting. We don't want you splitting the contract into multiple parts so you can exceed it, right? Same with entities or organizations or countries doing at war with us. You can't do that. So that's straightforward. We'll just skip through that. Also, this is also, we talked about this yesterday a bit, because this is part of the Uniform Guidance Update. You cannot buy equipment from the selected company, so be aware of that. Okay, so general procurement standards. The rule is full and open competition. We consider any restrictions, anything that restricts competition or of any kind, it could be any clause, we say that's you're restricting competition. So if you say, well, I'm only going to advertise something for one day and award it the next day, that's restricting competition. I'm going to say it's got to be this kind or that kind, any kind of clause, and that's what we look at. When we review procurements, we'll look at the RFP and say, is there anything in there that making it very restrictive why we awarded this? One of those things in the past was you can only buy from a company in Indiana. You know, you can only do business in our state. We said, no, that's restricting competition, things like that. You can use pre-qualified lists. That's good. Just keep them up to date. You cannot preclude bidders from qualifying during a solicitation period. And that's all should be in your policies and procedures, and again, addressing standards of conduct, conflicts of interest. We've seen organizations give money to related parties without going through a procurement process, sole sourcing things, all sorts of things. But when we see that you're not getting proposals back, and this happened, I think, in One Stop when we did first time we did the One Stop Operator. We saw a lot of real weird RFPs, no money in them. So how do you bid on something there's no money in it? You don't know what you're going to receive or what you're going to budget and so forth. You know, we went out once, we just sole sourced it to ourselves, the board took over. We said, you can't do all that. You can't do any of that. You got to go out and make an effort to bid. If it turns out it's a sole source, if you tried a couple times, you've done everything, your RFP looks good, and you only got one entity, yeah, then you can do that, right? And we'll talk about it a little later in the governance issue, because with the governor and the local chief elected official can agree that this is the case, but you got to go through that process. Can't put any unreasonable requirements on the firms to qualify for business, unnecessary or excessive bonding. You have to have large insurance. You're trying to get everybody you can to bid on this. Non-competitive pricing practices between firms and affiliated companies. We do business with ourselves. We've seen a lot of that where there's a for-profit and they may have a side, or they'll have a nonprofit, but they'll have a side entity that's a for-profit, a staffing company. So they just do business with their own company. Can't do that. I mean, staffing is a regular business out in the community. You need to get bids and quotes on how much they charge per person or per hour and so forth. Non-competitive contracts to consultants or on retainer agreements. That's, this stuff is, we always look at consultants and specialized awards. This stuff is always looked at. We know you have proposals for youth services and things like that, but when we see these other things, these are always looked at and scrutinized. You always have issues with it. How did you find a consultant? And they're out there. You know, you need a trainer like us. But we bid on this contract. You know, it wasn't like they just said, called me up and said, come on in. We had to submit a bid. There could have been other bidders and things like that. Especially organizational conflicts of interest, we usually find out after the fact that this company's related to that company or it's a relative, so forth. Can't specify brand name, or you'd say equal to Dell 386 so that everybody can bid on it. But you can't just say I need a Dell computer, I need an Apple computer. So any arbitrary action that would prohibit competition. Again, you want to try to, that's like putting something in the RFP saying, we've issued a proposal today and responses are due tomorrow. We're going to advertise it one day. That would be it. It's got to be in our community, it's got to be, you just have some weird clause that a lot of times we see that's done purposely to pick up one entity. It must be this, 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 and all these little things that only that entity can meet, right? That'd be an arbitrary thing. And we'd say, why is that in there? Why has it got to be this? Why has it got to be that? You'd have to justify what you're putting in your language in your statement of work of why it has to be that way. At a minimum, you must have this amount of insurance, bonding insurance, $10 million, when you don't require others to do that. Because there's only one big entity that can deliver that. Can we get a mic? Okay, talk. And so if they wanted to, do they register then, or they'd have to register? But can they submit a proposal prior to registration? So I would say that's not necessarily restricted. Long as you're not excluding them from bidding, they can bid and whatnot, with the contention that if they were awarded, they apply. But you can't also say, well, they're not in the system, so we can't select them. We're not going to give them points. So, they have to have time to be able to register if they're awarded. So you can't prevent them saying, well, they didn't meet this. So sometimes we'll have little clauses in there that say, if you don't do well, then we can't even rate you. You know what I mean? Right? And that's the other thing. Like a lot of states have bidding systems. They have a department that bids out a lot of stuff, and you just go in and buy. They've done all the procurement. That's fine. Counties and cities do that. That's fine. They're doing that regularly. Bidding out pricing for food and cars and all sorts, and you go online and you buy from them, right? And you can let subs, you can let them go in if they're allowed to go in and use those systems. Sometimes they're restricted, like, well, we don't want everybody buying off the state list because then it's taking us away from buying from me, because I'm not on the state list. So things like that. So to the extent possible, you always want to, like your micro purchases, if you can split it among suppliers. So that's anything under 10 grand, you're not required to get bids. That's like you're just shopping for everyday stuff. We just say, don't just keep buying from Target. Try to, buy from Target once, maybe Amazon another time. Your shopping price, and remember, when you're buying under Uniform Guidance Commercial, best price is the only thing you're looking at. The cheapest price, the best price. It's not the value, it's best price. If you want add-on stuff, you have to include that in your bid documents. I need this, but it's got to have a maintenance agreement for 4 years. You got to be able to provide service. You got to provide. Then you can do that. You can't take a price. You got a low price and then say, but this entity is a little higher, but they offer maintenance. You didn't ask for maintenance, right? So price always wins. Same with small purchases. You got to get your bids, adequate number of sources. You're hoping when you're bidding out, you got enough proposals coming in and so forth. You must allow sufficient time for them to submit a proposal, because that's considered restricting competition. We say, it's not written anywhere, but we would say, and I think the federal government and the FAR has it, I'll have to check, but we say usually things should be open for about 30 days. So entities have time to develop a proposal or a bid. And that's when you're required to get bids. You know, that's like if you're doing a big purchase, when you're above the big amounts, simplified acquisition, they have to have time to develop a proposal. Stuff you're buying where you don't need bids or you just need 3 and it's commercial stuff, usually you can shop that like you do every day. You go to Amazon, you go to the stores, you go here, go there. You can do that. You can only give awards to responsible entities. Contract integrity, compliance, do they have any issues, financial problems? You think they can deliver? You know, when I first moved to Chicago, I went away and they were doing a construction project in our condo, heating project. And I was away for 6 months. I came back and it was a complete mess. You know, our rooms, the heating ducts were messed up. So our condo board awarded a contract to a company, a plumbing company, that filed bankruptcy that day. You know, I was on it by like, why would you do that? Well, they were the lowest bid. I said, you know, so you didn't think to just cancel it the next day? And you know, then we spent like $1 million to have someone else come in and redo the work. But, you know, you got to be sure they can deliver. But the fact that they filed bankruptcy, that's a little sign of there's a problem. So you need to look at, you know, contract reform. This may not apply to you because you're not buying big things, but we would call this like if the state goes out and buys a new UI system for tax, they have to be on top of the contract when they're delivering deliverables, deadlines, are they meeting the specs that you've called for and all that? Because if they don't meet the specs that you've asked for, you can't be doing business with them. You know, you've asked for a set number of specs in your statement of work, and the more you put in there, of course, the price is going to go up because you're detailing every little thing that has to be done. So it might be a higher price, but they have to meet that. If they don't, they're not considered, you don't consider them. And of course, you have to keep your procurement records. Maintain the history of the procurement from the beginning, why you selected that method, what type of contract you used, the basis for the selection, and the price, right? That's called the procurement file. When you're dealing with bids over 250 or contracts over 250, you must do cost price analysis so that you're doing an estimate. And I'm sure you do that with all your procurements, except for small things. I mean, if you're doing something big, you're going to look at, what do we think this is going to cost? You know, we want to buy this. What's the average cost of this? You know, if you're looking to buy a fleet of cars, you're going to say, well, what's the range we want to spend on cars? What do we need? What is that range? So we have an idea what we're going to be paying or what the bid's going to be. So you do an independent estimate before you're receiving the bids and proposals. If you're dealing with commercial, you cannot do cost plus percentage of cost. Contracts are not allowable, right? So you can't have a contract. Usually when we have, these are more in the federal government, so we don't deal with a contract plus a percentage of cost on these contracts. It's a unique buying thing, but we just, remember this applies to everybody, all sorts of entities, so it may not apply to you, okay? General requirements, a description, your workforce plan, your annual plan, the state as well as the local plans should address how they go about competitively procuring or how they're going to select their service providers. You may follow uniform guidance saying we'll follow the risk assessment, we're going to select them, or we have procedures that says we must bid them out. This is our policy and procedures for awarding grants and buying things. Does not apply to the eligible training providers. There's a whole separate process for them to determine if they're eligible to be put on the training provider list, right? So it's not a part, so we don't procure them. And we don't procure people. Sometimes, like if you don't procure a person, that's an employer-employee relationship. Someone says we got to go out and bid our staff, or you advertise for them and you hire them, right? Sunshine provisions, everything's got to be made available. If we come in, the auditors, federal reviewers, public, they're able to see this information. They can request it. That's a big giveaway when you come in and say we want to see something, and they don't want to show it to us or whatnot. That's a big red flag there. Again, we talked about only awarding responsible entities possess the ability to successfully perform under the terms and conditions of the procurement. Considerations given to the integrity, public policy, record, past performance, technical. If you know they're in the business, they've been around for a while, they do good work, they've had good ratings, you buy from them. Just like what we do, right? You look at how they're rated when you're looking to buy stuff. You go on and see what rating, what people said about them and things like that. Not like me, I just point and click, I like that, and click and boom, big thing here, it cannot be debarred, suspended, or otherwise excluded from made ineligible participation, right? So you cannot you cannot award entities that have been debarred. Not procurement, I mentioned this, hiring staff, wages to participant, workers' comp, public utilities, medical care, travel, banking service, telecommunications. Those are not, you're selecting those. You don't go out, I mean, maybe you could go out and bid on banks. The state may do it when they run the unemployment program because it's such a big processing and there's fees involved and it's a lot of money. So they may shop their banks, you know, to see who gives us the best deal and the best service and things like that, clearing processes, you know, stuff like that. But everything else, you know, you could travel. You're sort of just who takes you there, and then you pick the best price or what's best for you traveling, right? Times and everything. Maybe more money, maybe less money. So, again, informal, micro, small, formal, sealed, competitive, sole source. So, micro is anything under 50,000 if you raise it, right? Small has gone from 50 to 250. No bids, 3 bids, sealed bids. If it's over 250, you must do sealed bids, right? Competitive proposals, request for proposals, sealed bids, the same as invitation for bids, things like that. We call it a lot of different things. Those are competitive proposals. Like your policy may say we compete all our service providers. You go through that process. We don't set a threshold, or maybe you set a lower threshold. And then we have non-competitive. These can change. Generally, when the FAR changes, they've updated the uniform guidance. That's what's caused these changes. Because the federal acquisition, these are sort of tied to the federal acquisition, which governs how the government buys things, right? So they set the thresholds when, you know, when we buy an aircraft carrier, or we're buying whatever, we set those thresholds, and then we've pushed them down to the system. So again, we said the micro, we've increased it's up to 10, but you can go up to 50 now if you have the things. You can be awarded without soliciting competitive quotations if the price is reasonable. You try to distribute standard things. Everything's standardized. You know, we need a number 2 pencil. We need paper. It's a set ream of paper, things like that. And then supplies and equipment, you still need prior approval if it's over 10 for only a direct grant. Again, we say the states in your system, you follow state, what they tell you, what their thresholds are, but a direct grantee between DOL and you, like a youth build, you come to us for prior approval. It's per unit cost, not cumulative. So you can buy 50 computers at $9,000. We look at what's the individual computer. We don't look at, you know, $400,000 worth of computers. It's individual. So we want to make this simple. Everyday buying, you know, you go out, you get the quotes, you buy it. It's less than the threshold. They're starting to adjust it for inflation. When it's 50 to 250, you need at least 3 adequate. We consider 3. Okay? So between 50 and 250, you got to get quotes. Low price always wins. Okay, if it's over 250, which I doubt any of you do that, maybe the state does it sometimes, but they may do it at their level, not at your agency level. You must publicly solicit, must be open minimum 30 days. Usually a firm fixed price contract is awarded and it's payable on delivery when they deliver that item on that day. If they meet the specs, you must pay, okay? It's usually used for big projects. Prior approval, fixed award. If you wanted to do it with our money and do a fixed price award, like we're going to award maybe a youth service and it's going to be $400,000 and it's just a lump sum amount, you would have to get our approval. You know, they'd have to be real specific of what they're delivering to pay them on that date when they deliver it. You know, you'd have to get DOL approval for that. Rarely, I've never seen this with in my history of going to DOL and doing something like that. I mean, usually you're dealing with large automation projects of where we've seen it, and that's handled differently, like through UI and unemployment systems. There's a lot of upgrades to the systems now and so forth. and they're dealing with formal bids and so forth, things like that. Competitive, if required by your policy or statute, you know, so that says you have to go through it, you keep it open 30 days, you solicit from as many sources as you can. You have written methods to evaluate the proposals and award process. How do you go about that? Using points. You put together a team. They sign conflict of interest disclosure. I have no conflicts, or I disclose any conflicts. If they have a conflict, they shouldn't be on an evaluation team. So you want to disclose that I have no conflicts, I'll be on a rating team. It's kept confidential. And of course, what's most advantageous? You're writing a solicitation saying, we're looking for these type of services in this area, approximately these many people, these type of services. How would you do that? Price is a secondary factor. They have to meet what the statement of work means first. You look at that, rate that. If it's acceptable, meets what at least meets the minimum, because you could have several proposals. Then you start looking at the price and say, okay, we got these 4 awards. We think they're all pretty decent. They've all met the level of meeting the specs. Now let's look at price and see if there's allowable costs in there. Question? No, it's not in there. It's not in there. That's why I said before, 30 days, it's like sort of been the standard in history, right? This is where you can't say, well, we're going to have it one day, right? That's why I say minimum 30 days, because otherwise you say, why are you making it shorter? You're asking for this service. That's a clause. It's like you're limiting competition. 23. Of course, so that's state law. So, okay, that's fine. Yeah. This is like our benchmark. So it's state, you know, you're dealing states a little bit because you're following that, but like locals, if they're following city, you know, whatever, you can't just say 2 days, 1 day, or if you're a standalone board, this is where we've seen your standalone board doing. I know you're all part of like a government entity, but we have a lot on the mainland that are like 501c3 nonprofits, so they're completely separate and so forth. I'm not going to talk about engineering and those kind of things. That's really unrelated to us. Again, so how do you do it? What's our need? What do we want? What are the parameters? Do we do our market research? Establish parameters and timeframes. When do we need it? What's the method we're going to use? What are the requirements? Are we going to develop? Who develops the solicitation? Evaluation factors. Identify the panel and signatory authority. This is the big one. Who develops the solicitation? You know, we saw this a lot in the one-stop first days of, you know, the board's developing the solicitation and then they're bidding on the project. You can't do that. That's specifically prohibited. If you're part of the proposal, you cannot bid or be awarded those funds. That's a clause in there. We'll come to that. So this is all part of the planning phase, right? Again, no geographic, except for allowed by statute. What method? Incorporate clear description. Remember, the more you write, the more costly it becomes. You know, if it's standardized stuff, you just go out and say, we need number 2 pencils. Who supplies those? Identify all the requirements you can to fulfill, because you're reviewing that proposal. So you want to state everything in there, and you're only rating it on if they meet that, you know? So you can't rate other things that were not asked for and so forth. And you try to publicly advertise 30 days, right? Macy wants to know, how did you guys do your one-stop competition? What, 8 years ago, 9 years ago? Of course, you're doing it when was the most recent round of one-stop operators, you know? Are you all on sort of the same period of time, you know, every 4 years? You recently did it? Oh, yeah. And how'd it go? Good? No bids? I presume here, because you're out on island, it's hard to get a lot of entities. So is it agreement between the governor and the chief? So who is your one-stop operators? The county? Okay. Anybody else? Yep. Oh, wow. Individuals. Oh, right on. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. No. He's a government. He says he's got 2 individuals that bid on it. Good. So you're evaluating them now, I take it, or you're in the evaluation process? Yeah. Oh, good. You know, that's interesting, individuals applying, because, you know, that's probably a better deal than entities, because you don't have a lot of entities out here that will apply. But you could have individuals, and it's sort of a person, it's a person in the past, it used to be the board, somebody on the board doing this. Why wouldn't that work? That'd work good. That's a good idea. You have to let us know how that goes. That sounds good. That might be a good best practice. I mean, this has been a very difficult thing, this one-stop operator. Nobody knew it was coming when they wrote WIOA. It got thrown in there. We thought, of all the things you're going to make competitive, why would you pick the one-stop operator? You could have picked all these proposals or program providers. One-stop operator is a unique role. You know, it's really the main functioning role, the general partner, the one-stop, and dealing with all the agencies. Why would you say that has to be bid out? We don't know how that came about. It's been a mess. It was a struggle for us to figure it out, write the guidance, and go through. And the first year was a real mess going through it. And you know, everybody across the country couldn't get proposals, and nobody put the money in. The place where one thing I saw where it's one of the best practices in a couple states is they put all their WIOA money in their one-stop operator proposal. They say you can be the one-stop operator and deliver adult, DW, youth. You tell us what you want to deliver. Because the company will say, well, I'll do it if I'm going to get one of the funding streams. I'm not going to do it just for 10 grand, you know, for a year to just manage all this stuff. But if I know I'm going to run adult or DW or youth, well, yeah, I'll be the one-stop operator. And usually that's what you have. You have an entity that's a provider of services as well as the one-stop operator. So like in Michigan, we have some big counties, and they have substantial money. They have, you know, 5 comprehensive centers, and they put out all their money. They'll have the allocation by their areas or by their counties within this big metropolitan area, and say, we're looking for 5 one-stop operators, and you can bid on all or none of the program money. So some will come in and say, we'll be the one-stop operator, and we'll do youth and adult. We'll do this and this and this, and then they just fill in the gaps and say, okay, well, if you're gonna do that, you can still also become the other provider for services that were not part of your bid.
I have a question. Did you say
Mike.
Did you say an individual is?
No, a specific nonprofit organization.
I thought you meant person.
Yeah, I was thinking 'cause we don't give this money to persons. But what is your situation though? It's a nonprofit or for-profit?
So we, the company, run the center. Of course, we've been in violation of the firewall for mega years.
I'm okay with that part.
So, yes, we put the RFP out, and we contract people, companies.
To companies,
Yes.
okay.
Oh, yes, I misunderstood.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, I'm
So
good.
if they fall through, we already have our waiver set up we do it just
Yeah.
because when we met with our Region 16,
Right.
they said they noticed that we did it
You get
multiple
concurrence from the
times
governor,
and
right.
failed, so.
Good.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Phase 2, release and evaluation. So you publicize the procurement, you prepare the proposal to bid, maybe you host a bidders conference. We did this when we did one-stop grants. We brought everybody in, said we're gonna have a bidders conference. We asked all the stakeholders, what does one-stop mean to you? What does it include and whatever? And then we went back and wrote the proposal, the solicitation, and issued that for the grant awards back in the day. Collect your proposals, you rate them and score them, right? Straightforward. This is really big. We look at this. How you doing the points? You know, where are you putting points? Who's doing the scoring? Are they kept separate? Are you keeping the information confidential? Where was that? Somebody told me recently they did an award, and somebody asked them like, well, we didn't win. We want to see what the others was, and a person released all the information to them. And they told me this, and I almost like dropped the phone. I said, what? Well, I said, that's company confidential information that you're sharing with another competitor. You can't, I was just flabbergasted, like, and it was just, I think a new person didn't know better, and they just released it under, like, people asked for it, and they released it, and I thought, oh my God, you can't do that. I said, they could all challenge it. You know, now you're opening yourself, because the winner, something, he's going to turn around and sue the person or sue the entity for doing that, but. Yeah.
It stops everything.
Yes,
So if your contract is ending, now you have no provider.
that's right. That's why you have to have an appeal process and a protest process, and you have to have days of how that happens. You know, you had so many days to file an appeal. If somebody wants an appeal, you know, you have to, certainly you do it ahead of time, like, you know, let's say July 1st, you need the new, way back in March, you should have had an idea of who's been selected, but you have to have appeal. They appeal how many days? 30 days, 10 days. After the appeal, who hears it? The protest, because you cannot do business or make an award until that's all taken care of. And we've had some thrown into court and everything. It just stops everything, Or we go back and say, well, you got to do it all over again, you know? Again, panel, sign conflicts of interest. Be sure they're aware of the code of conduct policy, right? Evaluation criteria based on the statement of work. So you set up points. A lot of people use points for that. That's the easiest way. Some people say, well, you can't use points. And I'm like, I'm not sure how you'd use another way or how you'd score them, who's high or low, or, you know, red, yellow, green, things like that. Establish range. What's unresponsive? What's the minimum? If you use a point system, and most of you use point systems, I presume, what's the minimum level where they meet? How many points do they need? You need to set that, like 70 or 75. At 70, 75, they met it, so you can consider all those. Everybody below didn't meet it. You want to go back to them and tell them where they could have improved. The ones above, you can then work with that whole group. And you can go back and say, we want a best and final. Go back, we think you're low in these areas. Even though you met, you're low in a couple areas. Go back and redo it and send them all back in, and then we'll re-rate everybody, right? Funding ranges, exceeds the funding range, things like that. Assign the proposals, individual or groups. Sign the scoring sheets and date them. Because that's the first thing we look at. I'll say, I want a procurement file. I'm going to look at these three awards. I want to see the procurement file. I want to see all the stuff with it. I want to see the sheets, what you wrote, whatever, how it went. And I take it from beginning, when you started, to all the way till you close out that award. How you paid them, what kind of agreement you used, what kind of performance, all those kind of things. Right? Meets or exceed, you can negotiate a best and final. Unresponsive, you go back and provide them TA. Right? So they didn't meet. You want to hope they do business with you. They just weren't good. But you go back and say you didn't address this area. You were low here. You were low there. Work on that. You know, next time you can come in and you know, maybe we can award you funds. You want to try to have as big a pool as possible. And I know it's unique here because you're on an island. It's hard to get service providers out here and so forth. But you try to do the best you can, and just the key is document that process. Everything you did, the steps you took to do it. Negotiate. Good. That's a big no-no. That's right. That's right. That's a big no-no. You know, I mean, once you publicly solicit it, or it's out there in the street, you can send it out to people, but you can't, like, well, we're going to be, you know, we had a person in our office, this is a couple administrations ago, we were going to award some funding, I don't know if it was LMI funding, you know, and finally, and it was just a general thing, like, we're finally awarding funding for, like, you know, the system. And one of our FPOs contacted her state saying, you know what, we're going to be soliciting soon. We're finally putting money in this area. And she got suspended. There was like, you released information that they should not have heard. They'll get it when they see it. You don't have to tell them it's coming because they can start preparing to bid. You know, and they'll have a little extra advantage. That's right. No, you can't do that. It's real important, these panels, who's on evaluating and sharing information. It's really looked at because this is a high risk area. You know, salaries and all that is not high risk. This is a high risk area. You're giving money out. It's the biggest area of fraud we see. Well, you can tell people, yeah, go on our site, here it is, go find it. You can't tell them anything about it. You go, there it is, you know, you can read it and so forth. Yeah, that's right. That's fine. And it's usually publicly, you should have it public. You know, we say post it in journals, but usually you're going to post it on a government website or your website and so forth. So anybody's got access to that. That's right. We're going to get to that. Let's come to that. Let's not jump ahead. We got a whole section on firewalls. Don't worry. That's a whole afternoon session. So, you know, once you negotiate, you're going to negotiate performance levels. You know, they got performance. Negotiate a fair and a reasonable profit if it's a commercial organization. We say reasonable and fair, no more than 10%. That's what we consider reasonable. If it's more than that, and we'll talk about profit specifically because it's very unique, so we'll come to that. Negotiate payment. How are you going to pay them? What kind of agreement? Is it cost reimbursement? Is it a per unit? You're buying things, every deliverable you're going to pay for it, things like that. Reimbursement. When do they, what's their plan to start serving people? We realize agreements with new entities, it takes a while to get up and running before you start getting performance. Cost reimbursement contracts puts risk on you because you got to manage that subrecipient to be sure they deliver performance, or you're left holding bag at the end. Fixed unit, when you pay it based on a per payment, well, if the contractor does, or the subrecipient doesn't deliver, or contractor, you don't pay them, right? So there's no risk to you. Negotiate the contract MOU or agreement. You don't have necessarily agreements with a government agency. You might just have an MOU. We're going to do business with the State Department of Mental Health for services, or VA, things like that. You're not entering into a contract. You're entering into an MOU. What do we get from you? How are we going to pay you, and so forth. Obtain who's the authorized approval. Keep in mind when you're doing a sole source, be sure everybody's aware of that. The board's aware of it. Who's ever signing it's aware of it, that it was a sole source, so that you show you went through all the steps. We always look, DOL always looks at every sole source award. Because we always look as like, there's got to be someone else. There's got to be, show us that there's not another entity out there. You make an offer, accept, and then you execute the agreement, right? Proposals that meet or exceed, or in the RFP, you can do best and final. We said that. Discuss areas of improvement for the ones that haven't. You can negotiate with all proposals which meet or exceed. So you go back to all of them and say, you did well here, but you're weak here. Best and final. Come in again. Give them another time frame to do it. It does not necessarily have to be 30 days. It could be 20 days or something less, but it's got to be something reasonable. We would say, well, you can't do 1 day or 2 day and then end up just picking the one you wanted, and re-rate the proposals. Again, we talked about protest. Submit a bid protest award, you have to stop. Grounds, written objection by the party, solicitation, they go through this, cancellation, you can't do business, or you terminate the award, so forth. There's things like that, so be aware of that. Be sure that's in your policies and dated, because if there's no dates, it goes on forever. We had an instance in Chicago, and we had a big disallowance, and we went to the state, and it was under the city, in the city of Chicago, the Mayor Daley. So the state, we went to the state, went to the city, and we had a big disallowance with their subrecipient. And we went to the state, we said, you got to pay back the money. Well, they said, we're going to fight you. They hired one, they were a very powerful entity, very well connected to the city. Back in the days, in Chicago, if you can't help your family, who can you help? That was their thing, right? And the city stood behind them. So now we're talking, the state's like, wait a minute, we're in the middle. You got DOL breathing on the state's neck and the city on this side coming up. We're stuck in the middle. We're going to the state. You got to pay the money back. They went in, we went into court. We're going to go into court. It stayed at the local area because they found, went into the procedures and they said, oh, it's a grant. We have this whole nother appeals process. So they invoked that. They had a top law firm in the city. It lasted for 12 years, okay? And we never issued, we told the state, you got to deal with this. So we never issued a determination because we said the state's going to have to deal with this. The state spent millions of dollars doing a forensic review. They spent millions of dollars. 12 years went by, people died that were involved. And it was still like 14 years, finally get a call from the city attorney saying, we got to settle this thing. We got 2 mayors down the road are now in office. He's coming. We want to close. I said, well, let's make an offer and let's get rid of it. This is the amount we're talking about. Make us an offer that's reasonable. We collected a decent amount of money, but there was this could have lasted another 20 years because we didn't even step in yet. We would have had to gone through the determination and then go into our appeal process. So that's why it's real important that you have deadlines, that you file appeal and it's closed out, and how far you can appeal. Somebody protests, they appeal to your board. Then they appeal to the state board, and then that's it. They can't come up to DOL. You know, we don't hear procurement bids or protests. It stays at your level. They maybe have secondary, you could have something in your court system, or if they got to go in the court to do it, but it doesn't come up to us. So you want to close those out right away. But it just depends how big the award is and so forth. And be sure you have like termination clauses or cancellation clauses, things like that are in there, certainly for allegations, stuff like that. Well, no, they were upset. I mean, the city spent a lot of money. The state spent millions of dollars. It was like a 1.5 million disallowance. Should have been more. Should have been more. Should have been about 10 million. We should have disallowed. It was a sub. It was a sub. Yeah. The president of the sub was charging our grant $1 million salary. He had kids on his business, his son and daughter. They were getting paid $500,000 a year. Okay. It was like they got a big grant. It was like an $18 million grant, and they were charging $300,000 a month for supplies. You know what the supplies were? Come in to file a claim, and we're going to provide you Starbucks and food and donuts to file your UI claim, and that was it. Okay. So we should have lost all of it, but it was like, I mean, it was just a complete mess. But it was like 15 years. It just lasted forever. It was just hanging out there, and finally, like somebody says, we got to, let's get this dealt with. We do not want to spend the state's like, we do not want to spend any more money. The city's like, we do not want to spend any more money. Everybody's gone. There's no point anymore. The sad news is they still do some business with the government. There's still a service provider in a couple areas. Yeah. Why they never get, we couldn't debar them because there wasn't any, suspension to debar them on. We had no document to say you violated this. We just told the state, you're going to have to pay us back. So the state gave us so much money, the city gave us so much money. Yeah. Again, we've talked about this time frame for protesting, processing, all that stuff. You want to go through that. Cannot proceed to appeal decision is issued, could result in penalties. It stops at the state workforce area or state ALJ, right? Not. No, I think we went out and just did a monitoring of it. We found it. We were doing our routine monitoring. Well, this was a special direct grant from DOL. This was a national emergency grant. This was during the airlines in 9/11. We gave out several grants, all these areas that had airlines that were going out, closing down in Kansas City and Chicago. All the hubs were getting money because they were all getting laid off, kind of deal, right? And they got like I think 9 or 15 million, something like that. It was a big amount. And Debbie, I don't know if you know Debbie Strama. She's chief policy. She went out and did the review and came back and told us this, and we were like, "You got to be kidding me! You got to be kidding me!" You got Starbucks and like all their muffins. I mean, they had Starbucks come in and cater like their orientation sessions. How do you spend $300,000 on supplies a month? Yeah. So. Anyway, so let's continue. That's one of the best ones we had, but we settled it. We got money. But yeah. No, it was bad when you went in and the director had a picture of him and the mayor and President Clinton on the wall. We knew this was going to be a doozy, right? Those are back in the days, And that's it. The thing is, like I say, is where there's big money, that's where you got to really look because there's big money to grease. If it's not enough money, you cannot get away with that. But when you got big money, it gets, gets overlooked sometimes. And, Illinois is a big state. They got big grants and all that. But I think they did. I think the state did. Yeah, I think we did. We went out and did a review, routine monitoring. We filed an incident report. It was a direct grant, yeah. And then we went to the state and said, wait a minute. OAG said, you go do it. We can file an incident report, FPO. Well, they got to go through a process. They weren't convicted of anything. We didn't even issue a determination. Anyways, we can talk about, but we came back, we did the review, and we filed an incident report, the OIG, and they said, you deal with this. So then we went to the state and said, you deal with this. This is your sub. We're coming to you. You deal with it. What? Oh, yeah, way before Doge, yeah. We'll be doing that with Doge later, So we'll be ready for it, right? Anyway, so let's continue because I don't want to run out of time. I'm not sure when we got to cut off here. Non-competitive proposals. So we look at these all the time. This is the number one thing we look at for abuse. There's only one source. You can do it when there's a public exigency or emergency to permit, you can't deliver because there's an emergency. Or the federal awarding agency says you can do these, right? You gotta show that competition was determined to be inadequate. You tried a number of sources, you didn't get any. You didn't do. Lack of adequate planning is not justification. Oh, it's Monday morning, I forgot to do this, I'm gonna run out and sole source, you can't. Of course, now the limits are so much higher. I don't know what you'd go out and say, or I'm gonna buy a building, I forgot to rent the house, tomorrow I'm renting it, So it's a little different now, but we're talking big proposals generally. No equipment in the last year, we don't allow that. Unacceptable delays in time, but you must do, or cost price analysis is no longer required for that on sole source. That used to be required, now it's not required. I don't know why. But you gotta document, you've gone through the process, be sure you can explain it, be sure everybody's aware of it, your board. You don't want your board knowing that when they open the paper, a sole source award was given and the board didn't know about it, that it was sole source. I only say this in Chicago because when I first started, everything was sole sourced by the city or the state. It was always somebody connected. I could tell you stories after stories. A guy called Quarters, he'd steal quarters from the toll box, but they all were connected. It was just in the day. Big cities have that, they have connections and they want to award funds to their donors and whatnot. We see it now in the federal government. I'm just going to sole source to so-and-so because this. But we look at all that. So we make sure you go through a process. You don't see it as much now because we've done business. One-stop competition, first round, we saw a bit of it. We said, no, you can't do that. You're going to have to go out and rebid again. But we don't see it in our other things. There's not too many things we sole source now. We had some other grants that were very unique equipment, and they were buying from one entity. We said, no, there's probably a couple makers of this automated robotic arm. They're not the only ones. There's 3 or 4. There's Japanese, there's Germany, there's Sweden have robotic arms. Why are you just always buying this one? But we don't see that anymore. Again, the cap, the fixed amount is presently $250. We removed that. Fixed awards, you must have DOL approval to do fixed awards above that amount. So you establish your procedures. Unwritten prior approval is required. Okay, so that's buying things. Generally, we're talking buying things, paper, folders, right? Things like that. Competitive proposals are different. You may do that process for those kind of things. Like we're going to do a competitive proposal because we just want to see what's out there at that price. We're not doing sealed bids, but we're going to do a competitive proposal. Okay? Uniform guidance now says competitive selection of subrecipients. You follow, you got to follow what it says. But now uniform guidance says you can select your subrecipient if you go through a process. You're not required to competitively compete it unless your policies and procedures call for that. Okay, that's a big change. We made everybody compete everything. Now you don't have to compete your subrecipients, right? Except for the one-stop operator and part of the youth service provider, and we'll talk about that specifically, right? Otherwise, you got to follow. So if your policy says we competitively procure everything over this amount, you have to follow that, or you have to change your policy. Yeah, we're going to cover that. Yep. You're jumping ahead. Yeah, that's what it is. That's what it says. You can select. You got to go through a different process. Unless the state or city says, our rules say this. You follow that, right? Let's talk about specifically to WIOA. Youth. The rule on youth is the board can deliver the various elements internally if they want. The ones they choose not to develop or deliver, they must compete those. The regs are fuzzy, but the official ETA policy is if the board wants to provide all the youth elements, they can do that without competition. The ones they choose not to, they compete, right? One-stop operators, you must do a competition. Try to do continuous improvement, you must compete every 4 years. The exception is if you can't find anything with the concurrence of the governor and the local chief elected official, they can approve the selection to pick themselves, right? So it's got to be concurrence with the chief elected official and the governor. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in another section, but 'cause that's one of the agreements you have to have. So keep in mind, One Stop's always competed. Youth is a split. Again, 121, this is in the law, so we have to do it. We have regulations around it, and then we also have guidance letters around that. One-stop operator, it's required. We're looking every 4 years. We've talked about that. Background, I don't think we need to go on this because we've been through this a lot. Except for, you want to define what you're doing, what they're going to do. You have to have a description what they're going to do. A lot of these entities are going to provide other services, and we'll talk about that in the financial governance. We talk about if they're a provider also, you have to have certain agreements. If they're doing this, they have to have certain agreements and approval from the CEO, the governor, and so forth. And we'll talk about that a little later. Any other services you have to spell. You have to have firewalls, certainly if they're doing other things. They can do all these other things, but there's rules around those and certain things. Other thing is like space. You own the space. They're going to operate in your space. We've seen some. One Stop will say, well, we'll be the One Stop operator, but we're doing it over here. It's like, well, that's no good. It's got to be in either your building or you're subject to their building, and that may not be where you want to be, So you have to spell that out. You're going to be the One Stop, but this is where you're going to do it at, not in your location. Because if they go away, and then you don't have a center, per se, right? They're required, what are the roles? Coordinate delivery of partner services, identify the objectives, they measure performance, report performance, assist in negotiating MOUs with the partner, sharing the IFAs, additional costs. They reconcile, do IFAs, all these kind of things, right? Provide program services and report performance. They can be a service provider, the career services. So they're allowed to do that, but there's a process. They have to, they have to have a firewall, and they have to have agreement to say, we're going to also be the youth provider, we're going to be the adult provider. So they're allowed to provide other services. They could be the fiscal agent. They could be the one-stop operator, same entity. They could be a career service provider. They could be an adult provider. They can even possibly be a training provider. They can be all these roles. The key is they have to have firewalls and so forth, and we'll talk about that a little later. Yes, microphone in the back. Let me get a drink real quick. What do we got all the time? What time do we end? What time do we end?
So Tom, in that scenario where you said, if you have a one-stop operator and they want to operate from their facility versus yours, is there an advantage? I know the disadvantage, like you said, if for instance they go away, then you're left with no one-stop. But what if the advantage is that they own the building? So your rent would be dramatically reduced. So it makes sense to actually have the operations in their facility.
Nothing prevents you from doing it. You just got to think about that, because if they go away, then what do you do? That's the only concern is, like, what happens if you change the one-stop operator? They could still be a provider. They could say, well, we're not going to be one-stop anymore. We're going to be adult, youth, DW, and these other things. And they keep that building. But the thing is, you got to look at, does that work out for you as the board? Does that work for you?
But wouldn't you have time, considering it's a 3-year, 4-year contract?
Yeah,
and
that's
all
right. You
that?
got a few years,
And
yeah. Unless
maybe-
something that we're, unknown to happen. But
Correct.
yeah, that's right. No,
Review the parameters,
Right.
and then at a certain time, then evaluate
Right.
whether it makes sense.
Right, and if it's in the right location, there's all those things to consider where that location is. Does it meet the needs of the board where participants can get to? When you're considering space, and again, the building is always the most important. It's always the biggest fight. Like, is it in the right area? Is it big enough to accommodate all the partners? For example, the One Stop, is that going to be a comprehensive center? Can all the core partners be
Fit
included
into
in there? Can they fit in there and all that stuff? If that all works out, you can do that. Just be aware. Usually, I can speak, most areas, they control their facility. They've gotten rid of all the ES office, all the stuff. The progressive boards have got together. State says, you guys all get together and find a facility that works for all of you. So a lot of them have gone to the old malls, the old Kmarts that have closed, all that stuff. Big parking lots, there's a lot of room. Everybody gets accommodated. They're not shoved in the back or the basement of the ES office, things like that we used to see. But, you know, it meets, that's where the board wants to have the services delivered. And you operate in our facility, so you can, people can come and go, providers can come and go, you can change and whatnot, but you control that. Otherwise, you put it all with them or that entity, they sort of have the control, you know? And you don't have as much remodeling or fixing things and all that because they control the facility, right? 4 years. No, wait, 3 years. It's 3 years. OSO is four. It's four. It's four. Yeah, 4 years. Yeah. So.
So I don't think we've actually seen reconciliation of the IFA costs.
Okay.
So
Why not?
Because they claim they're doing it, but it's not providing it.
Use the, speak into the mic. Nobody can hear
I
you.
don't want to get COVID.
She's saying they've never seen a reconciliation. Well, you're the state, right? Your monitors go out. Do they look at it? And they don't deliver it? Is it a finding? It's a finding, right? You got to see. I mean, if everybody's, is everybody happy with the agreement? I mean, there must be some sharing of costs. So I think, you know, we assume they're doing it correctly. I mean, you got to rely on them that they're doing it correctly. Otherwise, I would think an entity would complain or whatever. But they're all reviewed. They're all audited. You're reviewing. If there's an issue, you'd write a finding, right? You know, if there's an issue like, well, I wouldn't say, well, they're just not reconciling it. Maybe they don't need to reconcile the way they're working it out, sharing monies or whatever. I mean, it all depends what the IFA calls for. She's saying they've never seen a reconciliation of the IFA by the partners. Let's not get in. Okay. You know, and they have all these extra roles, you know, performance. They don't determine performance. They report the results. You know, they're sort of their entity of they're the managing partner in the one stop. Make sure everything's working properly. We'll talk about the roles and responsibilities in another session. Again, special considerations. If the local board is selected to serve as the OFO as a one-stop operator, the local chief elected official and governor must approve that selection. And the state has certified one-stop centers in the region, right? Question?
Yeah, can I actually go back to the youth service slide?
Okay. Do I gotta go back to the slide?
Yeah,
Yes.
that one. When it says the local workforce development board can provide all of the WIOA youth services elements, and then you had said that they can do some of it and procure the rest, right?
If the ones they don't do, they must procure. So if they, I don't know, how many are there in youth? I'm not a youth program. 14. Say they want to do 10. They can do those 10. The other 4 got to be procured competitively. They can do all 14. They can do any combination. Ones they choose not to deliver themselves, they have to procure.
So then the actual service would be done by staff members of the local board, so they couldn't go outside of that.
But were you asking who's providing it? The local? Well, if the board says we're going to provide it, who's doing that in the board? They probably have staff, right? They'd have youth staff or, I mean, hire staff. The boards can hire staff. They can hire staff, so they'd hire those people to provide those services, whatever. They can choose to procure them all. We're just saying if they choose to do it, the ones they want to keep, because a lot of boards say, we'll handle this, we want to do it, we have staff, we provide, but the ones they don't, they procure. They could procure them all, too. It doesn't matter.
Okay, I have a follow-up question. So the board can decide to do it themselves without a competition to select themselves?
The board is allowed to provide it, so there's no selection. They
Okay.
can say, we're providing them.
All right, okay. And then...
It's not a competition.
Okay,
We've decided we're going to provide these youth services. Ones we don't, we're going to contract out.
okay. Now, then the firewall, you're going to talk about that.
Yes, we got a
Okay.
whole section on
All right.
firewalls this afternoon and later in here.
Okay, one more thing. So then, when it comes to the one-stop operator, it has to be competitively procured. So the board cannot decide on their own, unlike the youth one. The board cannot on their own say, we'll be the one-stop operator. They have to still procure it competitively.
If a local board selects itself as the OSO,
Yes,
It's got to get concurrence from the chief elected official and the governor to do that.
So selected means after a competitive solicitation.
Yeah, they got to go through a process. That's right. They have to compete. They can't just say, well, we're not even going to compete. We're just going to select ourselves. They got to go through and say, we didn't get anybody. We tried 1, 2, 3, 4, 7
Right.
times. We got nobody. We are going to be the one-stop operator. They would go to the CEO and say, yeah, I guess so, you know, and the governor would say, you can't find, you've done everything properly. The RFP looks good. All that's fine. Nobody bid on it. Well, then somebody's got to do it. They can select themselves.
So that's different from the youth one. The
Or
youth
they
one
could
is-
sole, you know, or they could sole source it. They could say, you know, we're gonna go approach Evan, and just say, Evan, will you do this for us? Because now you're in sole source. So what are the rules around sole source? We want Evan. How much will you do it for? We're gonna just hire Evan. You can do
Okay,
that.
okay.
Okay, so that'd be part of the process.
I
I
see.
mean, this would be a step before. You'd have competitive, then you're in the sole source,
Okay, get it, I get it.
and then part of that sole source is pick Evan, or we're just gonna pick ourselves.
Okay, and then so the other question about that is that if the local board, could they apply in the competition to be the one-stop operator, or are they only, is
They
that
can
choice-
submit a bid, but they can't be part of the writing the proposal.
Right, right.
We'll cover all that.
Okay, and then one more. You said the local board could also do a solicitation where the one-stop operator can also bid for the adult dislocated worker or even the youth operator
Yes, I said
role.
that.
So does it have to be a separate solicitation or can
No,
it
no,
be?
no, it'd be
all-
one solicitation.
Oh, okay.
They go out, in Michigan, they go out and say, in this area, we're looking for a one-stop operator. There's $2 million available. You gotta be a one-stop operator, and there's $2 million available in adult DW and youth money. It's broken out. You decide to bid what you wanna bid on. You can say, I want all that money. I'll bid $1 million and I'll do all that. Or you know what, they'll set aside money saying, you tell us how much you want you have to tell us in the bid how much is gonna cost to be the one-stop. And if you want any of these other things, tell us how much you want to do that. That's how the RFP is written. So they come in with the bid saying, I'll do the one-stop for the 100, and I just want to be a youth provider. That's it. Okay?
So this
So that's
is,
why they're getting bids, because not only you're going to be one-stop, you're going to get these other funds.
and this is where the firewalls become very important.
We're going to get there. We're going to get
Okay.
there. We're going to run out of time. We're going to get there. Got a whole session on that. Okay, if the local board is selected through sole source, the CEO, governor must give prior approval. The local board has established sufficient conflict of interest policies and procedures that have been approved by the governor, right? So you got to have conflict of interest to be sure that you're on the up and up. If you just didn't do it, you know, that's what we saw, and so forth. If they want to provide, and we'll talk about this a little more, if the local board wants to be a career service provider, concurrence from the CEO and the governor must approve that, right? A lot of these got to have concurrence from the governor and the CEO. Local board wants to be a training provider, must grant a waiver to do so. We're going to cover that a little later because that's a separate session, but I'm just putting it in here because it's all part of a procurement type process. So it's sort of duplicating. Entities selected are considered subrecipients, must file the guidance 200 and 2900. ETA requires for-profit entities that are one-stop operators to also file the guidance relating to earning and negotiating profit. And you got to be sure if you're paying profit to a for-profit, it's reasonable and fair. And why are you justify the amount you're paying. Is that it? Is it? That's the last slide? Oh, yeah, cool. Oh, wow. Oh, my God, I got done 2 minutes early. I'm on a roll. Yeah, so we're going to, we're going to get in a lot of areas that are specific. So that section in the afternoon called WIOA Financial Governance, we're going to go through, there's 16 agreements you have to have relating to all these kind of things. If I'm a provider, if I'm a this, if I'm a that, it's got to be in concurrence. It's got to be approved. It's got to be prior approval. All that. We're going to cover those one by one. Some of it's duplicating, like we're going to talk about IFAs and MOUs, but we'll go through each of these and those questions. Also in internal control, we're going to talk about firewalls, conflict of interest, because that's really important. The uniform guidance in WIOA is beefed up a lot of sections in the law and the regulations about conflict of interest. Okay? So let's take a break. 10:45 back.